Peter Hayes hated the sound of Slack notifications more than alarm clocks now. Every time that sharp little pop echoed from his laptop, his shoulders tightened automatically because it usually meant another problem, another deadline moved forward, or another message from his manager asking why something was not finished yet. By 7:30 on Monday night, the entire office floor was nearly empty except for Peter and the cleaning staff vacuuming near the elevators. But his boss still stood behind his chair criticizing presentation slides like the company would collapse if one chart used the wrong font size. "You need to start acting like someone who wants to keep this job," his manager said while tapping the desk impatiently. "I'm tired of fixing your attitude." Peter stared at the monitor without answering. He knew arguing would only make things worse because his manager enjoyed dragging conversations out until Peter finally apologized for things that were not even his fault. The project timeline had been changed 3 times in 1 week, half the team missed their updates, and somehow Peter was still the one getting blamed because he stayed quiet while everyone else threw excuses around the room. By the time he finally left the building, the rain outside had already soaked the sidewalks and the cold wind coming off the street hit him hard enough to make him regret not bringing a heavier jacket. His backpack felt twice as heavy as usual, mostly because his laptop charger, project files, and unfinished reports were still shoved inside. Peter walked toward the subway station with the same numb exhaustion he carried almost every night lately, head down, headphones in, trying not to think about the fact that he would have to wake up and do all of it again in less than 8 hours. The station platform was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder near the yellow line, staring at their phones or blankly into space while the next train screamed into the tunnel. Peter already knew how this would go because it happened almost every evening. The train would arrive overcrowded, nobody would move, and he would spend 40 minutes standing between strangers while trying not to fall asleep on his feet. When the subway doors opened, the crowd pushed inside immediately. Peter squeezed into the car with everyone else, gripping the overhead rail as the train lurched forward. Someone's backpack slammed into his shoulder from behind. Another passenger elbowed past him without apologizing, and somewhere near the far corner a baby started crying loudly enough to cut through the noise of the tracks. Peter closed his eyes for a second. His head was pounding from staring at spreadsheets all day, and he had skipped lunch again because his boss dragged him into meetings back to back. The train swayed hard around a turn, making him stumble slightly before he caught himself against the pole. That was when he heard a calm voice beside him. "You should sit down before you pass out." Peter turned his head and saw the man standing from the seat near the window. He looked older than Peter by maybe 4 or 5 years, broad shoulders filling out a faded denim jacket, dark hair slightly messy under a black cowboy hat that looked strangely out of place in downtown Chicago. His boots were dusty like he had walked through actual dirt instead of city sidewalks, and there was something steady about him that immediately stood out from everyone else in the crowded train. Peter blinked. "No, it's okay." The man gave him a small amused smile. "You've been swaying like a tree in a storm for the last 3 stops. Sit." A couple nearby passengers glanced over briefly before returning to their phones. Peter hesitated another second before finally lowering himself into the seat because honestly, his legs were killing him. "Thanks," he muttered quietly. "No problem." The man moved to stand beside the door, one hand casually gripping the rail while the train rattled forward. Peter expected the awkward silence that usually followed small interactions between strangers, but instead the guy nodded toward Peter's work badge hanging from his bag. "Long day." Peter let out a tired laugh. "You can tell? You look like you fought somebody in an office and lost." That actually made Peter smile a little. "Pretty close." The man chuckled softly. "Construction clients are the same way sometimes. Everybody acts like the world's ending over paperwork." Peter glanced at him properly this time. "You work construction? Own a ranch outside the city. We train horses, do trail rides, sell livestock sometimes. I come downtown a few times a month for business stuff." He shrugged lightly. "Still hate the train every time." Peter looked down at the worn leather gloves tucked into the man's jacket pocket, and suddenly the cowboy thing made more sense. "A ranch," he repeated. "That's kind of hard to picture near Chicago. Most people say that." The conversation should have ended there, but strangely, Peter did not want it to. Something about this guy felt easy in a way nothing else had lately. No fake corporate smile. No passive-aggressive comments hidden behind professional language. No pressure to sound impressive. The train slowed toward the next station and Peter's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He already knew who it was before checking the screen. His manager. Peter sighed under his breath and answered immediately because ignoring calls after hours usually led to even worse problems the next morning. "What?" Peter said quietly. His manager did not even greet him first. "Did you send the updated files yet? I told you I'd finish them tonight when I got home." "Well, the client moved the review meeting to tomorrow morning, so now I need them within an hour." Peter shut his eyes. "You said Wednesday." "I said tomorrow now." The line went dead before Peter could answer. For a second he just sat there staring at the dark phone screen while frustration twisted in his chest hard enough to make him feel sick. He barely noticed the train arriving at his stop until the cowboy spoke again. "Hey," he said gently. "Your stop." Peter looked up quickly. "Right? Sorry." He stood fast, shoving his phone back into his pocket while the doors opened. "Thanks again for the seat." "No problem, city boy." Peter rolled his eyes tiredly but smiled anyway before stepping off the train into the crowded station. He disappeared into the moving crowd without looking back. The train doors closed again. 2 stops later, the cowboy noticed the wallet sitting alone near the edge of the seat Peter had just left behind. He picked it up immediately and opened it carefully, probably expecting to find cash or cards spilling out everywhere. Instead, the wallet looked painfully ordinary. A nearly maxed credit card. Receipts stuffed carelessly into the side pocket. A wrinkled employee ID with Peter's exhausted face staring back at him. Then Drake Carter paused when he found the small Polaroid tucked behind the ID card. The picture showed Peter standing near Lake Michigan sometime during summer, smiling openly with sunlight hitting his face while wind pushed his hair around. He looked completely different there. Relaxed. Happy. Alive. Drake stared at the photo longer than he meant to, because the man sitting across from him on the subway 20 minutes ago had looked nothing like that version. Drake flipped through the wallet again until he found a business card with Peter's number printed near the bottom. He hesitated briefly before pulling out his phone and dialing. Peter answered almost instantly, breathing hard like he had been rushing through the station. "Hello? You lose something?" Silence. Then suddenly, "Oh my God, my wallet." Drake smiled to himself slightly. "Yeah, you left it on the train." "Seriously? Thank you." "Jesus, I thought I lost it." Peter exhaled shakily. "Can I meet you somewhere?" "There's a cafe near Jackson Station still open late." 20 minutes. Yeah, I'll be there." When Peter arrived at the cafe, rainwater still clinging to his jacket, Drake was already sitting near the window with the wallet resting on the table untouched beside 2 cups of coffee. Peter walked over quickly. "You seriously saved my life tonight." Drake slid the wallet toward him but kept one finger resting on the Polaroid photo. "Can I ask you something first?" Peter frowned slightly. "Sure." Drake lifted the picture carefully. "Why don't you smile like this anymore?" Peter froze completely. Not because the question was dramatic, not because it was rude, but because nobody had looked at him closely enough to ask in a very long time. Peter could not stop thinking about the question even 3 days later. Every time he opened his wallet, the Polaroid stared back at him like proof that somewhere along the way, he had slowly become a different person without noticing it happening. He still remembered the day that picture was taken. A random Saturday by the lake with coworkers back when he first moved to Chicago, before the overtime, before the panic attacks in office bathrooms, before every conversation in his life became about deadlines and presentations. Now he spent most mornings exhausted before the day even started. And somehow, the only person who seemed to notice was a cowboy he met on the subway. The strange part was that Drake did not text too much after that night. No flirting. No constant messages. Just small things that somehow felt more personal because they were simple. "You survive work today? Storm coming out here tonight. Your city coffee tastes like burnt dirt." Peter found himself smiling at his phone more than he wanted to admit. By Friday afternoon, his manager dumped another emergency assignment onto his desk, just as everyone else was preparing to leave for the weekend. The company had purchased land outside the city for a luxury eco-resort project, and someone needed to visit the surrounding properties before the next investor meeting. Normally Peter would have complained internally and accepted it anyway, but the moment he saw the location listed in the email, he sat up straighter. Blackwood Ranch. Drake's Ranch. Peter stared at the screen for several seconds before rubbing a hand across his face. No way. Unfortunately, it was very real. The drive out there the next morning took almost 2 hours. The city skyline slowly disappeared behind him, replaced by long roads, open fields, and stretches of land that looked nothing like downtown Chicago. Peter had forgotten places like this even existed. By the time he pulled his rental SUV onto the gravel entrance of Blackwood Ranch, his shoulders already felt lighter. Then he saw Drake. He stood near the fence holding a horse by the reins while talking to another ranch hand. Sunlight hit the side of his face, and for a second Peter just sat there staring because Drake looked completely different out here than he had on the subway. More relaxed, more solid somehow, like this was the place he actually belonged. Drake looked toward the car and immediately broke into a grin. "Well," he called out as Peter stepped out of the SUV. "Guess the city keeps sending you back to me." Peter laughed despite himself. "Trust me, this wasn't my idea." Drake walked closer, wiping one hand against his jeans before shaking Peter's hand briefly. "You here for work?" "Unfortunately." "What exactly does your company want out here?" Peter hesitated. "Surveying surrounding land for development expansion." Drake's expression changed slightly at that, though not enough to seem hostile. "Resort people." "Yeah." Drake looked toward the fields for a second before shrugging lightly. "Well, as long as they don't try turning my horses into golf carts, we'll survive." Peter laughed harder this time, and Drake seemed quietly satisfied hearing it. The rest of the afternoon passed faster than Peter expected. He walked through sections of land with contractors and inspectors while trying to ignore non-stop calls from his manager asking for updates every 30 minutes. But the real problem started around sunset when the others packed up and left while Peter stayed behind organizing files inside his car. A knock suddenly sounded against the passenger window. Peter looked up to find Drake leaning casually against the door holding 2 bottles of beer. "You still working?" Peter checked the clock. "Apparently." Drake nodded toward the ranch house nearby. "Or you could take a break like a normal human being." Peter should have refused. He still had reports to finish before Monday and emails waiting unanswered on his laptop. Instead, he found himself following Drake toward the back porch while the evening air cooled around them. The ranch house was warm inside, filled with the smell of wood smoke and something cooking slowly in the kitchen. It did not look fancy or staged like places in magazines. Boots sat near the door. A jacket hung over one chair. A half-repaired saddle rested on the table beside scattered tools. Real. That was the word Peter kept thinking. Drake handed him a plate of barbecue and sat across from him at the kitchen counter. "So," he said, "how bad is your job really?" Peter let out a tired breath. "Do you want the polite answer or the honest one?" "The honest one's usually more entertaining." Peter took a drink first. "I wake up every morning already stressed because my manager treats every project like a life or death situation. Nobody leaves work on time, and somehow the reward for working hard is getting even more work dumped on you." He shook his head. "Half the time I don't even know why I'm doing it anymore." Drake listened quietly without interrupting. "That bad?" Peter laughed bitterly. "Yesterday I ate vending machine crackers for dinner while fixing someone else's mistake at 11 p.m. That answer your question?" "Jesus. And the worst part is everyone acts like it's normal." Drake leaned back slightly in his chair. "Out here, if somebody calls me after 9 at night, somebody better be dying or a horse escaped." Peter smiled weakly. "That sounds nice." Drake studied him for a second before speaking again. "You know what I noticed about you the first night?" Peter raised an eyebrow. "What?" "You apologized 3 times for sitting down." Peter blinked. Drake shrugged lightly. Like you thought taking up space was bothering people. The words hit harder than Peter expected because they were true. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed loudly on the table again. Manager. Peter stared at it without moving. Drake glanced down at the screen. You gonna answer? Peter honestly did not want to. For the first time in months he felt calm, and hearing his boss's voice would ruin it instantly. The phone kept vibrating. Finally Peter grabbed it with irritation and answered. What? His manager immediately started complaining about missing files, changing deadlines, and investor expectations without even asking where Peter was or whether he had eaten all day. Drake could not hear the full conversation, but judging from Peter's expression, he did not need to. Peter finally snapped after nearly 4 straight minutes of criticism. I'm literally working on a Saturday night, he said sharply. What else do you want from me? Silence. Then his manager coldly replied, maybe someone with your salary should stop acting like a victim. The line disconnected. Peter stared at the phone with his jaw tight. Drake spoke carefully. That guy always talks to you like that? Peter laughed humorlessly. Pretty much. And you stay? Peter rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. I don't know how not to. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Drake stood up suddenly. Come outside. Peter frowned. What? Trust me. Curious, Peter followed him out toward the back field behind the ranch house. The sky above them stretched endlessly dark and clear now that the city lights were gone. Peter stopped walking automatically when he looked up. Wow. Told you, Drake said quietly. Peter had forgotten stars could actually look like this. They stood there in silence for a while until Drake moved toward the fence nearby where 2 horses rested quietly under the dim ranch lights. You ever ridden before? Peter snorted. Does a mechanical bull count? Drake laughed. Absolutely not. Before Peter could protest, Drake gently guided one of the calmer horses closer and adjusted the saddle quickly. Come on. I'm gonna die. You'll survive. 10 minutes later Peter sat stiffly on horseback while Drake walked beside him holding the reins, clearly trying not to laugh at how tense Peter looked. This is humiliating. You're doing great, city boy. I hate when you call me that. No, you don't. Unfortunately, Drake was right. As they moved slowly along the fence line, Peter realized something strange was happening. He was not thinking about emails, or deadlines, or Monday morning. For once his brain felt quiet. Drake glanced up at him. There's the smile from the picture. Peter looked away quickly. Don't start. I'm serious. Peter shook his head, but he could feel warmth creeping into his face anyway. Later that night, after Peter finally climbed back into his rental car to drive home, Drake leaned down toward the open window casually. You know, he said, you look a lot less lonely out here. Peter's chest tightened unexpectedly. Neither of them said anything for a second. Then Peter cleared his throat awkwardly. See you around, cowboy. Drake smiled slowly. Yeah, you will. Peter started finding excuses to return to Blackwood Ranch after that weekend, and the worst part was that the excuses were not even convincing anymore. At first he told himself it was work-related because the company still needed land reports and environmental assessments, but eventually even he knew that was a lie. Most of the actual project meetings could have been handled through email. The truth was simpler than that. He just wanted to see Drake. By the middle of the next month, Drake's number had somehow become the most active conversation in Peter's phone. Their messages were still casual most of the time, but there was something underneath them now, something warmer. You alive in there, or did corporate finally kill you? Currently hiding in the bathroom during a meeting. Coward. You literally talk to horses for a living. They listen better than your boss. Peter laughed out loud at that one in the middle of a conference call and earned a confused look from 2 coworkers sitting beside him. The strange thing was how naturally Drake had worked his way into Peter's routines. Some nights Peter would leave the office exhausted and immediately check whether Drake had texted. Sometimes Drake sent photos from the ranch without context, sunsets over the fields, muddy boots after rain, a stubborn horse refusing to move. Peter started saving the pictures without realizing he was doing it. And slowly, without meaning to, he began looking forward to things again. One Friday evening, Peter arrived at the ranch later than usual after sitting through another brutal meeting with his manager. The second he stepped out of the car, Drake noticed the expression on his face. That bad? Peter dropped his bag near the porch steps. He rewrote an entire presentation at the last second and blamed me because investors didn't like the numbers. Drake handed him a beer without another question. Come on. They walked out toward the fence line while the sky darkened around them. The air smelled like rain coming, cool wind moving through the grass while horses shifted quietly nearby. Peter leaned against the wooden fence and rubbed both hands over his face. I swear that man wakes up every morning excited to ruin somebody's life. Drake stood beside him calmly. Then quit. Peter laughed tiredly. Yeah, because bills magically disappear when you do that. You really hate it that much? Peter looked out across the field for a long moment before answering. I don't even know when it got this bad. I used to actually care about the work. Now I just feel tired all the time. He swallowed hard. Sometimes I sit in my car outside my apartment for 20 minutes before going upstairs because I know the second I wake up, I have to do it all again. Drake stayed quiet, letting him talk. That was another thing Peter had started noticing. Drake never rushed conversations, never interrupted to make things about himself. He just listened like whatever Peter said actually mattered. I feel stupid complaining about it, Peter muttered eventually. Why? Because people have worse problems. Drake looked at him directly. Being miserable every day sounds like a pretty real problem to me. Peter looked away quickly after that because something about hearing genuine concern in Drake's voice made his chest ache in a way he did not fully understand yet. The rain started about 20 minutes later. At first it was light enough to ignore, but within minutes thunder rolled across the fields and heavy rain slammed down hard enough to soak them instantly. Drake laughed as Peter cursed under his breath and tried shielding himself with his jacket. Come on, city boy. They ran toward the ranch house together through the storm, both completely drenched by the time they reached the porch. Peter pushed wet hair back from his face while Drake unlocked the door. You look ridiculous, Drake said. Says the cowboy, dripping mud everywhere. Inside, the house felt warm compared to the freezing rain outside. Drake disappeared briefly before returning with towels and an oversized dark hoodie. Put that on before you freeze. Peter hesitated while taking it. You sure? You're already wearing half the ranch outside. Peter changed in the bathroom and stared at himself in the mirror afterward longer than necessary. The hoodie smelled faintly like cedarwood and smoke. Drake's hoodie. For some reason that thought alone made Peter's pulse feel strange. When he walked back into the living room, Drake glanced up from the fireplace and froze briefly. What? Drake shook his head once. Nothing. But the way his eyes lingered for half a second too long made heat crawl slowly up Peter's neck. The storm knocked the power out less than an hour later. The lights flickered once before the entire house dropped into darkness except for the fireplace glow. Well, Drake muttered. Guess we're camping now. Peter laughed softly for the first time all day. They ended up sitting on the floor near the fire with blankets and mugs of hot chocolate while rain hammered the windows outside. The quiet should have felt awkward, but somehow it didn't. Drake rested one arm casually across his knee while staring into the flames. You know, he said eventually, I almost left this place a few years ago. Peter looked over. Really? Yeah. After my last relationship ended. Drake shrugged lightly. He lived in the city. Said I was wasting my life out here. Peter stayed quiet. Drake smiled faintly, though it looked more sad than amused. He wanted apartments and parties and networking events. I wanted mornings feeding horses before sunrise. He looked down at his hands briefly. Eventually he said loving me felt like loving somebody stuck in the wrong century. That's ridiculous. Maybe. Drake shrugged again. But he wasn't wrong about one thing. Life out here gets lonely sometimes. The honesty in his voice hit Peter harder than expected. Because Drake never seemed lonely. He always looked steady, calm, impossible to shake. But suddenly Peter could see it. the quiet isolation underneath everything else. Without really thinking, Peter spoke softly. I think I forgot what it feels like to be cared for. Drake looked at him immediately. Peter stared down at his mug. Not professionally. Not people needing things from me. I mean genuinely cared for. He laughed weakly. That sounds pathetic. It doesn't. Peter swallowed hard. Most days I feel like I'm only useful when I'm fixing problems for somebody else. The room fell quiet except for rain and crackling fire. Then Drake moved slightly closer. Not dramatic. Not rushed. Just enough for Peter to feel the warmth of him beside him. You know what I think? Drake asked quietly. Peter looked up. I think somebody convinced you a long time ago that you had to earn rest. Drake's voice stayed calm and steady. And now you don't know how to stop surviving long enough to actually live. Peter felt his chest tighten painfully because no one had ever described him that accurately before. He looked away fast, blinking hard. Around midnight Peter admitted he couldn't sleep, so Drake grabbed another blanket and led him outside onto the covered back porch. The rain had finally stopped. Everything smelled fresh and cold, the fields silver under moonlight while thousands of stars spread across the sky overhead. Peter sat beside Drake on the porch swing wrapped tightly in the blanket. For a while neither of them spoke. Then Peter quietly asked, Do you ever feel lonely even when people are around you? Drake gave a soft, humorless laugh. All the time. Something about that answer broke through the last wall Peter had left. Slowly, carefully, he leaned sideways until his head rested against Drake's shoulder. Drake went completely still for 1 second, then gently relaxed against him. Neither of them moved away. The silence between them changed after that. Softer, heavier somehow. Peter could hear Drake breathing steadily beside him while cold wind drifted across the porch. And for the first time in years, Peter felt safe enough to close his eyes without worrying about what came next. A long time passed before Drake finally shifted slightly. Peter thought maybe he was going back inside. Instead, Drake carefully pulled the blanket higher around both of them, then lowered his head slowly and pressed the softest kiss against Peter's hair. Peter's eyes opened immediately. Drake froze. For a second, neither of them breathed. Peter lifted his head slowly until they were looking directly at each other, barely inches apart now. Drake's expression held something vulnerable there beneath all the calm confidence, like he was already preparing for Peter to pull away. But Peter didn't, because suddenly the idea of not kissing him felt impossible. So Peter closed the distance first. The kiss was slow and unsure at the beginning, both of them hesitating slightly like they couldn't fully believe this was happening. Then Drake's hand came up gently against Peter's jaw, warm and careful, and something inside Peter finally unraveled completely. No rushed movement, no desperation, just two lonely men kissing under a sky full of stars like they had both been searching for this longer than either wanted to admit. When they finally pulled apart, Peter stayed close enough that their foreheads still touched. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, because for the first time in a very long while, Peter no longer felt alone. Peter barely slept after kissing Drake on the porch. Not because he regretted it. The exact opposite, actually. Every time he closed his eyes, he kept replaying the feeling of Drake's hand against his face, the warmth of his body beside him under the blanket, the quiet way Drake had kissed him like something precious instead of temporary. By morning, sunlight poured through the ranch kitchen windows while coffee brewed somewhere nearby. Peter walked out wearing Drake's oversized hoodie again and immediately found Drake standing at the stove making breakfast like nothing life-changing had happened a few hours earlier. For one awkward second, neither of them spoke. Then Drake glanced over casually. You take sugar in your coffee, right? Peter stared at him. That's your opening line? Drake finally laughed, low and warm. I'm trying not to scare you off. You kissed me first. Technically, you kissed me first. Peter rolled his eyes, but the smile already pulling at his mouth gave him away. The strange thing was how natural everything felt afterward. There was no dramatic conversation about labels or confusion or panic. Drake simply moved around the kitchen beside him like Peter had always belonged there, occasionally brushing against him while reaching for plates or quietly touching the small of Peter's back when walking past. Tiny things. But Peter noticed every single one. At one point Drake handed him a mug, and Peter instinctively caught his wrist before letting go. Neither of them said anything. Drake just turned his hand slightly and squeezed Peter's fingers once before continuing breakfast. That tiny gesture somehow hit harder than the kiss itself. Peter stayed at the ranch the entire weekend. They fixed fencing together, drove into town for supplies, argued jokingly over terrible country music in Drake's truck, and by Sunday evening Peter realized something terrifying. He did not want to leave. Unfortunately, real life did not care about that realization. The second Peter returned to the city Monday morning, everything crashed back into him at once. 40 unread emails. 2 missed calls from his manager. Investors demanding revised projections for the ranch development project. And sitting directly on top of his keyboard was a new acquisition folder. Blackwood Expansion Phase 2. Peter opened it slowly, then felt his stomach drop. The company was planning to purchase nearly every property surrounding Drake's ranch through pressure contracts and manipulated environmental claims. Smaller landowners were already receiving offers far below actual value, and internal documents clearly showed executives expected most residents to give up after legal pressure mounted, including Drake. Peter stared at the screen for a long time, because suddenly this was no longer just another project. This was Drake's home. That night Peter drove back to the ranch without warning. Drake immediately noticed something was wrong the second Peter stepped out of the truck. What happened? Peter held up the folder silently. An hour later they sat at the kitchen table surrounded by documents while rain tapped softly against the windows again. Peter explained everything: the expansion plans, the land acquisition strategy, the fake environmental reports. Drake listened quietly through all of it. When Peter finally finished, guilt twisted hard in his chest. I didn't know they were planning this. Drake nodded once. I know. Peter looked up sharply. You're not angry? Drake leaned back slightly in his chair. At you? No. He shrugged. You didn't build the machine, Peter. Yeah, but I'm helping run it. The silence afterward hurt worse than shouting would have. Peter rubbed both hands over his face. If this project moves forward, half the families out here are screwed. Some of these people have owned land for generations. Drake studied him carefully for a second before speaking. Then don't let it move forward. Peter laughed bitterly. You think it's that easy? No, Drake's voice stayed calm. I think you already know what the right thing is. You're just scared of what happens after. That was the problem. Because Drake was right. For the next 2 weeks Peter barely slept. Every day at work became worse as pressure from upper management increased. Investors wanted contracts finalized fast, and Peter's manager practically hovered over his shoulder, demanding updated reports every few hours. Meanwhile, Peter kept driving back to the ranch whenever he could breathe long enough to escape the city. One evening he found Drake repairing fencing alone near sunset. Peter walked over quietly. Can I ask you something? Drake glanced up. Sure. If I walk away from this project, Peter hesitated. And lose my job because of it, what if I can't figure things out after? Drake rested both arms on the fence post. Peter, I'm serious. I know. Peter looked down at the dirt beneath his boots. My whole life has basically been surviving one paycheck at a time while pretending I'm more stable than I actually am. Drake stepped closer slowly. You know what I see? Peter shook his head. A man who's exhausted from becoming someone he doesn't even like anymore. Peter swallowed hard. Drake reached up and gently touched the side of his neck. You don't owe your life to people who make you miserable. The next morning Peter walked into the biggest meeting of his career carrying enough evidence to destroy the project completely. Executives filled the conference room. Investors dialed in remotely from New York and California. His manager sat near the front already talking about projected profits before the meeting even officially started. Peter listened quietly for almost 20 minutes, then finally stood up. I can't approve this project. The room immediately went silent. His manager frowned. Excuse me? Peter placed copies of internal reports onto the table. The environmental assessments were manipulated. Several land valuations were intentionally lowered. And the acquisition team knowingly pressured residents using false zoning claims. One investor spoke sharply through the conference speaker. Are you accusing the company of fraud? Peter looked directly at the executives. I'm saying you knew exactly what was happening. His manager stood abruptly. Peter, sit down. But Peter was done sitting down. For the first time in years, he was done letting people talk over him, pressure him, reduce him into someone permanently exhausted and afraid. No, Peter said quietly. I'm finished. The fallout happened instantly. Security escorted him out before lunch. His company email was disabled within the hour. By the time Peter walked outside carrying a cardboard box filled with desk junk and tangled chargers, cold rain had already started falling across the city, and Drake was standing beside his truck waiting for him. Peter stopped walking completely. How did you know? Drake shrugged lightly. You texted me meeting starts at 10. Figured I should be nearby. Peter laughed weakly, though his eyes already burned. I just lost my job. Drake stepped closer. You okay? No, Peter shook his head honestly. I don't know what happens now. For a second Drake simply looked at him. Then he took the box from Peter's hands, set it carefully into the truck bed, and reached for Peter instead. Not rushed, not dramatic. He just pulled Peter close in the middle of the rain while traffic rushed around them. You didn't lose everything, Drake said quietly against his hair. Peter shut his eyes hard. Then why does it feel like I did? Drake leaned back enough to look at him properly. Because you spent years building a life that was killing you. Peter stared at him silently. Drake smiled softly then, warm and steady in the rain. And now you finally get to build a different one. 6 months later, Peter stood behind the counter of a small cafe bookstore just outside town while Drake argued with a coffee machine that refused to work properly. You threatened it already? Peter asked. Yes. Try turning it on first. Drake glared at him while Peter laughed openly, fully. The same kind of smile from the old Polaroid picture, except somehow even softer now. The cafe had become their place slowly. Bookshelves near the windows. Fresh coffee every morning. Ranchers stopping by before work. Travelers wandering in off the highway. Drake handled the ranch while Peter worked freelance remote jobs from a desk near the back corner. And every evening, no matter how busy things got, Drake always kept one chair beside the front window empty. Reserved. For Peter. One night after closing, Peter found his old wallet buried inside a kitchen drawer while unpacking boxes upstairs above the cafe. The faded Polaroid slipped out onto the table. Drake walked up behind him and wrapped both arms loosely around his waist. There's that picture again. Peter smiled softly while looking down at it. Drake rested his chin against Peter's shoulder. So tell me something honestly. What? Drake kissed lightly beneath his ear. Do you smile like that again now? Peter turned in his arms slowly before kissing him once, warm and certain, then finally smiled. Better. And maybe that was the real meaning of love. Not grand promises or dramatic moments, but finding someone who made life feel lighter after carrying everything alone for too long. Peter thought happiness was something distant, something people like him were too tired to reach, but somewhere between a crowded subway train and a quiet ranch under the stars, he realized home was never really a place. Sometimes, home was simply a person waiting beside you at the end of a hard day. Thank you so much for listening to this story, and if it touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for more emotional love stories.